We have 5 years of testing soybean seed treatments on farm through MPSG's on-farm network from 2015 to 2019. We'll talk about those results today. But before we get into those trials, just a quick introduction on disease and insect pest targets of soybean seed treatments. So for disease targets, we're mainly looking to manage the root rot complex caused by Pythium, Rhizoctonia, and Fusarium species, as well as Phytophthora root rot. Soybeans can be quite susceptible to these root rots during early vegetative stages as they're getting established. So Pythium, Rhizoc, and Fusarium species, they have a pretty wide crop host range. Phytophthora, on the other hand, is a disease that's specific to soybeans. So the risk of these diseases impacting soybean crops is greatest in moist to wet soils and in fields that have a history of root rots. So Phytophthora and Fusarium root rots, they also generally prefer warmer soils, but saturated soils play the biggest roles, as well as your crop rotation history. How often do you have soybeans in that rotation? Those are some things to think about when you're considering your root rot disease risk. And then in terms of insect targets, seed cord maggot and wireworms are controlled by insecticide seed treatments in soybeans. Both are pretty sporadic pests. They only occur occasionally at economic levels in the field. So for seed corn maggot, risk is greatest with recent manure applications and when tillage before seeding incorporates live plants. They also prefer cool, wet soils. For wireworms, risk is going to be greatest in fields with a history of infestations. They can also occur more often following breaking up of grasslands, and they're most attracted to and survive the best in sandy to silty soil types. From 2018 to 2020, MPSG funded a research project through Brandon University to investigate wireworms in a bit more detail. So some interesting tidbits are that the abundance correlated directly with soil moisture, where more moisture meant less wireworms. For every 1% increase in soil moisture, wireworm abundance in the field was decreased by 15%. They were also more abundant in soils above 6 degrees Celsius and in fine, loamy soil types rather than in clay soils. There are other insects that are not managed by insecticide seed treatment that are on the label. So new this year, though, there are active ingredients with cutworms on the label, but when this research was being conducted, cutworms weren't on the label for our soybean seed treatments. So that's why I'm putting them on the not managed by for this trial. Bean leaf beetle and soybean aphids are on some labels as well, but it's important to be aware that established populations of bean leaf beetle are not known to occur in Manitoba, and that soybean aphids are mainly arriving in Manitoba in July on those southern winds, and that's considered to be outside the window of activity for our seed treatment products, which typically last about 3 weeks after seeding. And that brings us to our on-farm trials. Farmers have very few tools to actually estimate the risk from soil-borne pests. Seed treatments are pretty often applied on a just-in-case basis, with little knowledge of the risk soil-borne pests actually pose to a given crop in a given field. So informing this decision a bit more would be a positive step forwards. So these on-farm trials aim to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of seed treatments in soybeans. Will we see an improvement in plant establishment and a yield increase with a seed treatment in soybeans? So from 2015 to 2019, 43 trials compared treated soybeans to untreated in randomized and replicated strip trials across the province, and they're all illustrated in this map where they were. Seed treatments tested included Cruiser Max Vibrance, Evergoal Energy, and Evergoal with Stress Shield included. The top left is the percent of trials that used each of those products right here. So almost half of them were Cruiser Max Vibrance, and then an even split on whether or not that Evergoal Energy had Stress Shield included. The average seeding rate across these trials was about 186,000 seeds per acre. Half of these trials were grown on narrow rows, which are less than 12 inches. A third were grown on 15 to 20 inch rows, and 19% were on rows that were wider than 22 inches. On average, these trials were seeded on May 15th, and then the average seeding rate for each year is broken down in this table in the bottom right. In terms of previous crop, up here in the top right, most of them were going into wheat stubble, followed by canola, soybeans, and corn, in terms of what was the crop before those soybeans were grown. May rainfall is the data I have to indicate how saturated soils may have been for those trials early in the season. So here's the percent normal rainfall in May for each soybean seeding rate trial. Each bar is a different trial. So a third of trials had normal to above normal May rainfall, and those largely occurred in 2015 and 2016. Unsurprisingly, that's also when we most often saw a yield response in these trials, which we'll talk about more later. Before we get into yield, we evaluated early season plant stands in these trials to see if there was any difference in establishment between treated and untreated soybeans. So plant counts were taken at V1, where 10 feet of 2 rows were counted in each strip, and this was done on 2 different stops along the field where we counted those plants. So here are the differences in plant stand between treated and untreated soybeans for each trial. So what we've done here is taken the average treated seed soybean plant stand and subtracted the untreated plant stand. So for the bars in green, that's where there was a higher plant stand or a greater plant stand with treated soybeans. For the bars in red, there was actually a lower plant stand with treated soybeans. So what we're seeing is that about half of these trials, plant stands were greater with the seed treatment, and at half of these trials, plant stands were lower with the seed treatment. We might be seeing some damage from that extra seed handling there. On average, though, across all of these trials, plant establishment from the seeding rate was the same, 83% for both treated and untreated soybeans. So we're not seeing a difference on average in actual percent establishment. Highlighting specifically the trials that had a significant yield response, at half of those, seed treatment improved plant stands, and at half, plant stands were lower with the seed treatment. So we're seeing here that that yield response to soybean seed treatment was not always a result of a better plant establishment. Let's look at those yield results now. At 8 trials, or 19% of the time highlighted in green, soybean yield was improved with a seed treatment, largely occurring in 2015 and 2016, when we had much more of that May rainfall, saturated soils. On average, yield was improved by about 2.6 bushels per acre at those significant sites. There was also one single negative response in 2018, where we saw a loss in yield with treated seed. So in summary, soybean seed treatments without any prior knowledge of pest pressure in a field, they improve yield 19% of the time. We can fine-tune the use of seed treatments in soybeans, though, to make those informed seed treatment decisions on your farm. Evaluate the risk of specific insect and disease pests on a field-by-field basis. Is there a history of root rots or wireworms in a field? Are you seeding into saturated soils with more May rainfall in the forecast? How frequently have soybeans been grown in that field? Are you likely to be starting off with a greater risk? So MPSG also has a production resource, the Soybean Seed Treatment Risk Assessment. It's available on our website at manitobapulse.ca. And that's going to walk through each of those pests we talked about at the start in a little bit more detail. You can fine tune kind of the risk for your own fields and evaluate that a little bit more with this assessment. So if you are interested in learning more about this or any of the other on-farm trials, results are available in this database by visiting manitobapulse.ca, or you can follow this QR code directly to that database. If you would like to participate in a trial, please reach out to Ian. His contact information here is on the screen for our on-farm network. With that, thanks for your time today to talk about soybean seed treatments. I've been Laura, MPSG's Western agronomist. You can also follow us on social media to stay up to date on research results like these, or visit manitobapulse.ca.